Hello again. Thanks for showing up. I see many faces I saw last night, so I appreciate you doing double duty this week. As billed, I think we're going to start tonight. I don't know if there's anybody who wasn't there. Well, I see one face that wasn't there last night. Going to kind of recap what we heard last night. And since so many of you were in attendance, you can correct us if you heard something different. And then I think we'll maybe just play Stump the Consultant, or just kind of let you have some time. We'll kind of figure out how much time we've got available and kind of let people have an opportunity to talk to us and throw questions at us about things that are still nagging at them. And then and I really want to try to reserve a little time at the end, as we've tried to do, to take comments from the folks who are joining us tonight. So to get us underway, I'm going to let me see, most of you got, I was going to hand out things that you already got last night, but let's not waste the paper. I'll give one to Dick. I think we had a given the season, the perceived absence of parking and all that, I think we had a pretty good turnout last night. 12 or so tables full of folks, as all of you can attest to, and a fairly lively discussion. Got a lot of good, productive comments. I'm going to just for the benefit of maybe there's somebody at home or somebody in the audience, just kind of remind us of how we approached last night. We gave a general overview of, very general, painted with a very broad brush, about the about the provisions that have been included in the draft ordinance to date. Really kind of skimming the surface of the new provisions and how the chapters lay out in the new ordinance. But then what we did was we had been attempting over the past few days to kind of distill what have emerged to us, at least, based on the discussions primarily in this room with you all, of the issues that still seem to be kind of problematic, or that people seem to really want to continue to talk about. And we distilled that into a list of, I'd say there were kind of 6 general areas, but several topics within there. We talked to the group about proposed changes to the minimum lot size requirement for development of a detached house in some of our higher density multi-unit districts, our existing R2 or R12 and those types of districts. We have, as all of you have heard me say before, we are proposing, in the initial draft at least, that the minimum lot size requirement for the to build a single family, or what the new ordinance calls a detached house in those districts, would drop from today's requirements, which range from 3,500 to 5,400 square feet, down to a set 3,000 square feet, which we think is a good thing in terms of recognizing historical platting patterns in the community, allowing additional opportunities for detached, what is often owner-occupied housing. So we wanted to bring that to people's attention. We talked to them about proposed changes to the way that we measure maximum allowable density in our proposed multi-unit districts. We are proposing that we step back away from the existing approach, which regulates density based on the number of bedrooms in a dwelling unit, and simply go with a single maximum density limit in all of the multi-unit type districts. Again, that was a focus issue that we wanted to bring to people's attention. We also brought to people's attention some new proposed language in the planned unit development section of the ordinance, which would which would establish some parameters for the amount of flexibility that could be achieved through the planned unit development. process. Under today's ordinance, there really is no limit on what could theoretically at least be approved through the planned unit development process. And we thought from the standpoint of maybe a greater degree of certainty and predictability, both for the property owner, the developer, and the neighborhood, that maybe some limits ought to be placed on that flexibility, and we have proposed a 50% limit on any density increases that could be approved through the planned unit development overlay zoning district. I know that it's, for some of us, the first time we saw that 50%, we thought, oh, gee, that's a lot. But we did want to bring to people's attention that it needs to be compared to essentially infinity under today's ordinance, because there is no limit, and just wanted to fully disclose that to people. Of course, we're all familiar with some of the discussion we've had about the proposal to change the maximum allowable building height in our single unit, our detached house residential districts. We've proposed that change from today, what today is almost universally a 30-foot limit, except in the A residential district where it's 40 feet. We've proposed that in all those single unit detached districts that we change the height from 30 to 35 feet. But we've done that not to allow necessarily increases in building height in those districts, but in recognition of the fact that we're proposing that building height under the new ordinance be measured in a different way, or in a way that differs somewhat from today's ordinance. Today's ordinance allows folks to make use of what's referred to as the modified height limit, which allows you to measure maximum building height from the ground at the base of the structure. In the case of a pitched roof building, to the midpoint between the highest point of the roof line and the eave, or the bottom of the eave, which means that what is purported to be a 30-foot building could in fact be a much taller building, by virtue of the fact that we're not counting that portion of the building above the midpoint. Under our proposal, in all cases, we think we would propose measuring to the top of the building, but to do that and not penalize people, or not to sort of roll back what's allowable in terms of standard residential construction, we needed to add that additional 5 feet. And as we know, we've talked a fair amount about that. We also brought to people's attention the new ideas for conservation style development, what some communities call open space development, because that too has some density implications associated with it. The conservation development option that's proposed in the initial draft ordinance would require that a minimum of 60% of the overall development site, the entire subdivision, as it were, 60% of that be set aside and permanently protected as open space. And in exchange for that fairly aggressive open space provision, we would allow a whole lot of flexibility in terms of the size of the lots. You could cluster the lots in a really small area of the site on small lots with reduced setbacks. And in fact, under the conservation development option, there would be about a 20% density increase, again, in recognition of the public benefit that could be achieved by way of that permanent open space protection, the natural resource protection, the type of amenities that might be available to the subdivision residents at least, and in some cases, if the developer chose, to the public at large. Lot line houses. We all know that we've talked a fair bit about lot line houses, but we thought it very appropriate to let the community know what's being proposed in terms of lot line house, the garden house, patio house, maybe other terms for the lot line house concept. We stress that this doesn't represent a change in density. You couldn't simply plop a zero lot line house next to a conventional house and not have a side yard setback, which understandably some people were concerned about. That's really not allowed under the ordinance. We reminded them that there are standards to ensure some privacy and that the ability to maintain the zero lot line structure. Of course, given the interest in the zoning effort, there are a lot of folks who know about our initial failed attempt to come up with some ADU provisions, and we certainly wanted to let people know that, as I told you last time, our initial proposal that would have that proposed allowing accessory dwelling units in all residential districts as a matter of right was rescinded, and that we are reworking some kind of proposal that might accommodate accessory dwelling units in those neighborhoods who feel like that's a housing option that ought to be available in their areas, while offering adequate protections for those neighborhoods who feel like that's really not a part of their character. But we did commit again last night to bring some form of ADU proposal back. Our latest thinking is that it will likely be tied to some kind of overlay zoning designation, which would allow a neighborhood or a smaller part of a neighborhood to kind of self-select and apply for that overlay classification. Because it's a zoning map amendment, it would go through the full public process, planning board review, city council review and approval, and the rights of protest would be attached to it if the overlay approach is followed. We did let people know about our proposals to eliminate some of the existing overlay zoning classifications, the enterprise commercial, the CLB overlays, and the gasoline station overlay, and to replace most of those with an approach that relies more on kind of objective development standards and public review through more of a conditional use process. Bed and breakfasts have been a concern for some of us in these meetings, and we did want to let people know that the draft does propose that bed and breakfasts might be allowed in residential zoning districts. And finally, our distillation of the discussions to date suggests that the idea of allowing a new procedure that would accommodate some administrative relief or adjustment, modification of certain development standards was an idea that's proposed in the draft. We refer to that as the administrative adjustment process. It is fairly limited in its application as proposed. There are only a few things that would be eligible for adjustment or modification through the administrative adjustment process, but nonetheless there have been some concerns about the idea of vesting in authorizing and delegating to staff those types of modifications, despite the fact that it would require mailed and posted notice, and neighbors would have the right to weigh in, and in all likelihood, if there was significant opposition, the item would be bumped up to the Board of Adjustment through the normal variance process. So after my usual long-winded explanation of all of that, and we ask folks, as we have kind of tended to do in these workshops, to sit at their tables and talk amongst the group about things that they liked and didn't like about what they were hearing, what they were reading in the draft ordinance. We asked people specifically to try and come up with two things that they liked, that they'd heard or read about, that they really found that they probably could support, that seemed like a good fit for Missoula, and two things that maybe bothered them, at least in their present form or in any form. And then to use the remainder of the time to help us kind of think about adjustments we might want to make, or to identify other issues that should have been on the list of focus issues. We had a fairly limited amount of time to do that, but the groups were really cooperative, and here's what we heard from the reporting tables. This is not a verbatim distillation of what we heard, but we think a fairly accurate representation of the comments that were made. In terms of the things that people liked, you can see on the screen, there were at least 3 tables that included among their top 2 likes the idea that they found at least some of the ordinance a little easier to use and understand, and as they got familiar with it, they found the organization and format to be a little more comprehensible and user-friendly. At the same time, another group mentioned that we still need to do a better job of including graphics and illustrations in the ordinance, and I completely agree with that. There were 2 tables that that said they really liked the idea of keeping the ADU concept alive, and seemed to them at least that the overlay might be a good way to do it, either as a standalone kind of ADU overlay or maybe through the neighborhood conservation district, simply to use that tool, or the neighborhood character district rather, to use the neighborhood character overlay tool, which is included in the ordinance, as a way to modify the regulations for a neighborhood to allow ADUs and maybe other forms of housing that they like. On the dislike side, conversely, 1 table said they didn't like the idea of ADUs in the way they were originally proposed, and they wouldn't like them when they came back as an overlay or anything else for that matter. They really equated them to the PNC type mechanism and felt that was something that couldn't be supported. 3 tables, however, said that they disliked the fact that we abandoned the ADU section too early in the process. So a kind of mixed message, or varying opinions, I guess would be a better way to put it, on the subject of ADUs, which I think is maybe kind of representative of the discussion we had here, that some felt like it did have some promise. Maybe going back to the drawing board was a worthwhile effort. I think there were some of us who were skeptical that it could ever be appropriate. The lot line house option was mentioned as one of the top 2 likes in the proposal. At the same time, another group identified the lot line house option as something that just didn't feel right at all to them. Administrative adjustments got a vote in the like column and 2 votes in the don't like column. Some people felt like it felt to them like it was removing the public from the process. It was vesting too much authority in staff, and there just wouldn't be enough oversight from the governing body and boards and commissions. So they were a little fearful of that. The idea of reducing the minimum lot size requirement for the detached houses got a vote in the like column. But small lots, I think the same issue got a vote in the don't like column. So varying opinions, not surprisingly, on that subject. The 35-foot height change scored a like and a don't like. And I think a lot of tables, once an item was mentioned, didn't feel the need to sort of reiterate it. So I don't mean that just to be, exactly representative of an overall vote count, but this is how the tables are reported out. Conservation development scored a favorable vote at least one table, as did the rattlesnake overlay and the idea of keeping that around. The revisions to the planned unit development seemed a positive sign to one of the tables, and actually our first table identified the elimination of the CLB overlay as a positive. On the negative side, there were 3 tables that felt like there was the new ordinance in its draft form is still a little too inflexible when it comes to parking, that too much parking was required. One of the groups said that the maximum parking requirement that I think we've talked about before that would kick in for any use that requires 50 or more parking spaces, there'd be a maximum limit on the number of spaces. Some felt that maximum was too high, that we ought to be more aggressive in terms of limited limiting parking. And others felt like we ought to do more to recognize on-street parking availability and transit options where possible. Elimination of the PNC scored in the dislike column, as did the fact that the conservation development option would not be available in some of the smaller lot zoning classifications. The conservation development option, I think, only goes down to the R10 or maybe the R8 classification under the proposed ordinance, and not into the smaller districts, the 5.4s and lower, and some felt that was too limiting. The lack of provisions encouraging or accommodating commercial uses in R districts, mixed-use development within residential districts was cited as a dislike, as was the lack of residential design standards for more types of residential building types other than just townhouses and multi-unit buildings. A comment that we've, I think, heard in our discussions in this setting, the lack of scale and massing controls in residential districts was cited as a deficiency or shortcoming. Lack of incentives for multi-dwelling housing. I think this commenter specifically said that we ought to encourage higher density multi-dwelling housing near transit routes and where we've made significant investments in bike and ped improvements in facilities. Lack of flexibility in height regulations. Some felt that although we tried to strike a balance by raising the maximum height and changing the way we measure it, we may still be too inflexible when it comes to unique building designs or steeply pitched roof forms. Townhouse regulations were felt to be too strict by one of the tables, and the notion of allowing bed and breakfasts in residential districts was a non-starter for at least one of the tables that reported back. So, a few surprises for me in that list in terms of things that ended up in the dislike column that I thought would be in the like, and vice versa. But I was kind of pleased that people felt like the focus issues felt right to them. In general, there were, I think there's a few. We didn't have parking on the our focus list, but for many that was an important concern, and I think that's valid. A few miscellaneous comments that didn't really focus on the top one or top two likes and dislikes. I'll just kind of summarize here. One person said this still, despite our claims that this is a text amendment, a member or a person who was in attendance said this really feels like a rezoning. They considered it a rezoning, that they perceive this to be allowing higher density development, which would have lots of adverse impacts, including an increase in crime. Some questions about how the height regulations and the new height measurement provisions will play out in hillside settings, which is a fair question. We have not brought forward yet the revised hillside regulations from the zoning draft, and so we're aware that's a question, a legitimate question in people's minds. Some people cautioned us that the signs will be a controversial element, that the city's history with the PNC technique will color some people's perception, and that we need to kind of be careful about that. That was, who gets to, it was a question about who gets to protest in the case of, I think this actually was, do only property owners get to protest, or do residents and tenants of spaces get to protest? I think state law is fairly clear on that protest applies only to property owners, but I'd need to check that to be sure. How's an overlay initiated and by whom? I'll read into this some confusion perhaps created by us about the difference between an overlay and a new standard. I know that many people have used the term PNC overlay in the past as something that has created a real negative perception about overlays. P&C were never an overlay. They were a standard that was added that, but when we use the term overlay in this setting, when I use the term overlay, it is a zoning district. It goes through the rezoning process, and it has the rights of protest attached to it. We may, in fact, change our terminology about overlay and call them something like combining zoning districts or something like that to really make that, to really emphasize that point. Some people were confused about the implications of changing the way we measure density, which is a very fair critique given the fact that some of this can be very abstract, particularly when it's just a bunch of bullets on a slide and I'm talking through it. So we're going to endeavor to do a better job of trying to explain what those implications are. So that's basically it. In terms of last night, I felt it was really good. We got everybody out pretty close to on time, and we're going to consider this feedback as we are all the feedback we've been getting as we move forward in the coming weeks to try and prepare a revised draft of the initial cut at the zoning part of this. And that'll really be at the moment, we think that's probably the next thing that you're going to get, that you'll receive in the next 4 to 6 weeks. You will get a revised draft of all of the zoning material that you've seen to date. And that revised draft will show, I want to say it will show exactly what's changed since the last time you saw it. We'll use a red line and strikeout method to identify, so that you'll be able to quickly see they've changed this, they've changed that, they haven't changed anything in this section. And we'll attempt at that time to fill in the blanks in terms of provisions you haven't seen. Hillside, I think we want to try and do something with regard to alternate, like small wind energy devices, solar, things that'll kind of move us in the right direction with regard to some things like that the current ordinance doesn't address. And then shortly on the heels of receiving that revised draft, we'll focus more on the subdivision piece. We initially had thought that the Module 4 is the subdivision piece, and that was the next thing you'd get. But we kind of think it makes sense. We're focusing on zoning. Let's strike while the iron's hot. Let's prepare our second draft in response to the discussions and see where we're at. So, with that. We've got a fair amount of time. Let's take an hour or so and let you all have some time to talk. We've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people here tonight. So if we could maybe kind of go around and take maybe up to 5 minutes or so and just continue to ask us questions and make comments about things that are still on your mind and still dogging you. I don't expect that'll allow you to, maybe all of you, to get everything off your chest, but let's maybe do that if that makes sense to you all. Okay, Dennis, do you want to get us started?
The first question I have to you, Kirk, is after last night's events. Are we going to give any consideration to maybe how we do the public hearing aspect of these meetings? Because as you know, several complained of the format because many of us thought that it would be more of a format where the public would have individual opportunity to weigh in on this, not it be a workshop sort of situation. I realized that time was you were limited on that. But some of us feel like there's a need for the individual out in the neighborhood to be able to have more of a direct input rather than the same old faces that we have here or involved in the process more intimately. Yeah. And I know you were attempting to try to give an overview to those people, but time didn't make it work out as well. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I haven't thought as far forward as the format of the public hearing, nor do I have much influence on how planning board and city council conducts their business. I mean, I would imagine that when you have a public hearing on a zoning ordinance text amendment that the public is allowed to speak their piece for a time. Is that
Right, right.
I haven't actually attended a hearing at which a zoning ordinance item to amend a certain provision was there, but that's kind of standard course. So at the public hearing stage, at the very least, certainly, we won't be doing, small breakout group discussions in a public hearing format, so I would think folks would get an opportunity at that point. We can certainly see about, I'm not exactly sure what our schedule or expectation is for another public workshop, but if we're gonna have another public workshop, I'm certainly hearing that we need to consider a different format and maybe just handle it more as a community meeting and allow people to speak their piece. Yeah.
Okay.
So I certainly want to give you the impression we're taking it under advisement and do all we can, but that at the very least, people will have an opportunity in the public hearing process to do that. And I think, OPG's been kind of trying to do some outreach through the the neighborhoods and the neighborhood council process and all of that to allow people more time to ask questions too. So I think I don't want to speak for them, but I think that will continue too.
Mm-hmm.
That we'll continue to try and create a lot of ways for people to continue to show up and speak.
I would suggest that maybe, we talked earlier about, I think Lee was the one that brought it up, was the idea of the block system where you say, this is the regulation as it currently stands. This is how the new regulation will stand, so that people can readily visualize what the changes are going to be. I think, unfortunately, when we look at these new designations, the R5.4 or the R2.7M or whatever, it gets confusing. I know you're well intended in the beginning. You said that we're going to try to make this a lot clearer. Mm-hmm. But I felt it went downhill quick last night because people got wrapped up in trying to interpret what was being said with the 2700s and the 3000s, and you were doing your best. I give you credit there to try to explain it, but it was still confusing to people. People didn't know. They just really couldn't get their hands around what the changes were going to be, or whether there were even changes, or what's the difference here? What are we really trying to achieve here? Those, I think you need to get some kind of a block system as we move along here, so that when people do have an opportunity to weigh in on this more individually, from neighborhoods or as individual citizens, and how it's going to affect them, they can look at it and say, I don't understand this, and I don't understand why you need that, or I don't like this, or I do like that, or whatever. With some time to be able to, think that through. So that would be one concern of mine, is that we make it clear. We just got to really work on making it clearer, so that we know exactly, everyone knows exactly where we're headed. Another thing too, I heard your explanation on the PNC issue, and them not really being overlays. Personal experience tells me that I believe planning staff did kind of treat them like overlays, and we have a bad taste in our mouth about PNCs as overlays, because it seemed like when people were trying to do a house in a backyard, an alley house or whatever, that was always the tool, we called it, that came up. Oh, we can do a PNC overlay, and that'll allow you to do that possibility, and it became very indiscriminate, and I think we're really, really gun shy. And that's why there's so much discussion about the ADU issue. It feels like the ADU is just a PNC in sheep's clothing. Okay? And we fought that a lot. A lot of us fought that a lot. I'm sure a lot of people here remember the long evenings at City Council with hearings and whatever about that from very, very upset neighbors who couldn't understand why this was being allowed. And it's what brought us to this point, really, in the zoning rewrite. That's why you're here. I mean, because there was so much, dissension, amongst people, they just didn't understand. So those are the two major things that I had concerns about.
Well,
so
I appreciate that. Do you remember that summary that we put together comparing the proposed in the existing and proposed districts at the beginning of this process. Did you find that helpful? Is that the sort of thing that, an example of the sort of thing that you think would be helpful to people to get their arms around some of this jargon and
well, you kind of have to use the KISS system, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone has to have their own level to be able to understand it, and I think visually is the best. Visually, in columns, compare and contrast, to be able to see that, because they need to know how it's going to affect them, in their zones, in a proposed zone. And I think you're almost going to have to almost do that for every district, show what it is now and what's going to happen. And maybe that's your plan, but I think it needs to come out pretty soon.
I don't know that it's my plan. I'm gonna try and do a better job. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have a picture in my mind of what that looks like. And I guess what I would ask all of you is to help me think about it. And if you have if you could do an example for me of what you think would be helpful, I'd really appreciate it, because left to my own devices, I'll continue to confuse people, I'm sure, and it's really not intentional. By and large, I think some of the changes to the district are either nil or they consist of would allow this, where heretofore that wasn't allowed or would no longer be allowed. And I don't know how to express that graphically in all cases, and that's sort of the dilemma I'm in. So just help me think about it, and if you have some specific ideas about how I achieve it or how we achieve it, that'd be great.
And I do remember some of those initial charts and the initial examples that you gave us from other communities that you'd worked with, where you showed the end result, the zoning, and how clear it was and everything.
Yeah.
And we talked about that hope in the very beginning. I remember your concerns why we were so interested in having the right of protest, because in your mind it was going to be crystal clear when we got the zoning all writing. Well, we're already finding that it's getting muddier and muddier when we look at all our options, and at some point we have to make it very concise what we're going to do. And I think that's where I'm worried a little bit about the overlay as a backup, because it's been used and abused in the past. And I think we're really concerned that this whole exercise is more concise and eliminates that.
Good. Thanks.
So that's it. Thanks.
Lee?
I have a few little items I jotted down. When we get to the notification of the zoning changes, is that going to go out to people directly as property owners in first-class mailings, which will state what the changes in the zoning will be?
I don't know, nor do I have any control over that. So I don't know the answer to that at this point.
I think that's going to be a component as to whether this works or not.
Okay.
Because if it doesn't, people are going to feel they were being hoodwinked.
Okay.
And they have no idea what's really coming their way. 99.9% of the people have no idea what's going on. And this is a way of handing it out, getting it to people and say, this is what the changes would be. Then you'll get real public participation.
Okay.
And that may not be what they want, but that's what you'll get.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by state law, they have to, because this is a zoning change, you're changing numbers, you're changing lot size, you're changing a number of, under the amendments section in the current Article 8, it's very clear. Now, as for ADUs, I am adamantly opposed to these overlays because they're going to start neighborhood fights like you've never seen before. Because a group of, say, 8 or 10 property owners will say, gee, I want an ADU because I want to make some more money on the back of my property. And it's going to cause these flare-ups this is the reason we're doing the rezoning, is trying to get away from this kind of flexible interpretations which could allow great divisive issues to come up. And I think the ADU is one of them. You heard it last night. There are people who want them because they can actually see they're going to make money off of them, and then you have the others who want to preserve neighborhood character, and they're in the other camp. And I don't think that this is a very good idea. I think they should be very well defined as to where they're used and where they're not used. But letting them be flexible and let them go into the fight is just asking for a whole lot of trouble for city council. And so I also feel that going through the whole zoning book, I see nothing in here which works to preserve neighborhoods. Almost everything is a change in the neighborhoods, especially in the smaller lot areas where they're going to be completely impacted by them. And I think one gentleman pointed out that you could end up with 5 houses where you had 2. This is the kind of thing that I don't see that in this book that there's anything in here to preserve neighborhoods. And one of the feelings and one of the things that always has come out is that over 80% of people want to preserve neighborhood character. And that this isn't exactly going that way. It does provide more housing, it does provide more building, it does provide more profit, but I don't think it actually looks at the city of Missoula as to what we're going to be in 10, 20 years, and whether we'll even want to live here. So I think that's a serious issue. As for the public meetings, you have special interests here. You could practically pick out the table and say, here are developers, here are builders, here are realtors, here are preservationists, here are, whatever. You could pick out the table by table. And suggestion, you should have your public meetings specifically for developers, builders, and people who have specific interests so that you can hear exactly what they want. And you have the same thing for the neighborhood activists and, preservationists and so on. If you split it into groups, you'll get really well-defined wishes, which is where you started out at the beginning of this process. But come back to it after, the document is here so that specific things can be introduced. There was no discussion last night of signage, but we had at least 2 people who were there very much interested in that. And so I felt like the special interest, by running them together, you create an adversarial system, and you're not creating something where you'll get something positive out of it. Other questions I have, I think we need a referendum on this. I think it changes people's lifestyles and what they like or don't like, and I think a referendum is the way we should go. I think anything less than that is slick, and it's going to be viewed that way. Conservation says that you can have a 20% increase. The PUD is 50%. I think the 50 should match the conservation at 20, because a 50% increase is huge. A 20%, if you've got it across the board for like conservation and PUD, then it looks regular and appears to be more acceptable. Others may not like that, but anyway. Heights, I think we should go back to the 30 feet. The fact that they were cheating and going up to 33 feet is not acceptable. I think we go to 30 and we go to 2-story houses. It used to state in the old zoning, this allows for a 2-story house maximum. If we get into 3-story houses, that's going to be another big flare-up in the city because of the light and air and other issues for neighbors. Lot line houses, question I have is, can those areas between the houses now be used for driveways? If the lot line house does not back onto an alley, is the area between the 2 houses actually access for alleyways? And that's one of those things that I think needs to be very, very well defined. We want to make it so it isn't so completely political. Right now you've got 7-5 split on the city council. If they get to 8, then there will be no protest rights. The protest rights effectively will be wiped out. And I think that's a reality for a lot of folks looking at this and saying, we need to make sure that we still protect people and that the protest rights are real, that they are not fabricated. Then also the number of people required for a protest, is it 25%? What is it? And then I think we brought up at the breakout session the fact that the administrative procedures, anybody who wanted to do an appeal of the administrative decision, it was down to 15 days. Everything else is 30 days. BOA, everything else is 30 days. That needs to be also 30 days, because 15 doesn't give you enough time to find out what's going on, because that's going to be kind of a slam dunk for administrative procedures. That's it.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I have to agree that I was sitting down this afternoon trying to solidify my thoughts on the whole thing, and I have to agree, I think this whole thrust is heavily weighted to diluting the existing zoning protection that the people in the existing neighborhoods have, which I think is a shame. I've taken time to make a list, which I don't mind passing around. It's not a long list, and I've spoken to just about all these topics before, but pass this around that way, would you? I've called this list some of the key zoning revisions that I believe would adversely impact the residential neighborhoods and or individual homeowners in those neighborhoods, and basically would constitute a change to and relaxation of the existing zoning restrictions. No need to talk about them in detail. We have talked about some of them in detail before. Of course, the ADOs, at our table, for example, we had 3 people against them and 3 people opposing them, so we didn't comment on them because we couldn't come with a consensus. So there's obviously a divided consensus on ADUs. I don't know about the idea of having an overlay. It's very vague to me as to how you would actually get consensus within a neighborhood. We've all seen what goes on in neighborhood plans around here, that they're drummed up by a handful of activists in the neighborhood, well-intentioned activists, I might say, but they don't usually truly represent a true consensus and understanding of the whole area. So I'm not sure there is a good way to do that. So as Lee points out, you're liable to have a lot of debate and dissatisfaction as a result. That's what I think. Of course, bed and breakfast, this would be a perfect example how you could have made it real clear to people on that particular topic. You could have had a little block matrix thing and say, here's bed and breakfast. What's the existing code say now? Well, basically it said they weren't allowed, the only place they're allowed is in business or mixed districts where you have, mixed commercial, mixed business residences. That's the only place they're allowed now. So you could have said that. Now what are we proposing to do now? We're proposing to have them in all residential districts, but they're conditional uses. But then what are the criteria under the conditional uses? They're very minimal, so very easy to meet. So that's just an example of where you could have, and you could have plinked out some of these bigger items like some of these that I've listed here, and come right out in front of the people and say, here's what we're doing here to you on this, right?
You're referring to this slide. You thought this was maybe a misrepresentation? We're proposing it as a conditional use in all our districts, subject to use standards. They're currently allowed in BC, C1, C, and C2.
Yeah.
There'd be a conditional use process that require a public hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe that the use of bed and breakfast specific standards is probably more appropriate than applying the multi-dwelling standards to those types of uses. Now, had we put that in a column, would that have?
Well, maybe, but what you kind of alluded to was that you're going to have these good standards. It's going to protect the people about having too many bed and breakfasts in their neighborhood. But that isn't true. I mean, you're very weak in your standards. The only criteria is that the house has got to be 4,000 square feet. You know?
So do you think could you help us maybe with some standards that would offer that protection, or?
Well, yeah, when you got a bed and breakfast, you know, you've got a bunch more cars coming in late afternoon to park somewhere, right? And our parking regulations are, you know, you might say off-site parking, but take this example that you said about the wider space between houses on one side. I don't think our parking regulations preclude cars from parking in the setback area, you know? So you can just imagine a case where there's a bed and breakfast next to you, and then here come the
Well,
bed and
they do,
breakfast
as a
people, they're
matter
all
of
parking
fact,
on that setback
prohibit
area
parking
between
in the
houses.
front or side yard setback. There are express prohibitions on that, other than in an approved driveway. But fair enough. You don't feel like the standards that are attached do offer adequate protection, and I certainly respect your opinion on that.
Yeah, but I don't think there's no basis for denial should you go to the design review board and
Okay.
protest it. I
Okay.
mean,
Well, as you say, we don't
got a
need to
4,000 square foot house, what
debate
else?
all of these, and probably don't have time. But I appreciate you typing up the list. It's helpful as much as possible when you can give me specific comments and concerns. That's real helpful, and I appreciate you doing this.
yeah, because I think these are things that I would like to see addressed more properly in
Okay.
the proposed revision, you know?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, this is more, you know, this is helpful as opposed to saying you've diluted the existing protections. When you give me examples of the way that you feel we've diluted it, that's really helpful to me, and I do appreciate it.
Yeah, I would like to speak a little bit about home occupations, because we haven't, I don't think, ever talked about that in this group.
Okay, if we could do that real quickly.
What you have here is actually a much better defined document than in the existing regulations on what can be done as a home occupation. But I think the intention of a home occupation thing is that it is conducted within the home, and it doesn't have any exterior thing going on that would make anybody even know that there's a home occupation going on in there, right? And you say that in your introduction, that they may not produce any parking demand, traffic, or any exterior activity. But a couple of things that you then allow is an employee. Okay, well, there's a car. Yeah. And then you allow as many as three customers at any one time. There's three more cars. And then you allow delivery trucks to come. That's another car. So you could have 5 cars, and with customers, they're coming and going maybe all day, right?
You're aware that most of the home occupation provisions in the ordinance are existing provisions, are carryovers from the existing ordinance?
Yeah, but you've even refined them some, and I think you did a good job refining them. But these are the 2 gripes that I have.
Okay.
I think you've crossed over by allowing employees and customers to come and go. You've crossed over from a home occupation into a small business being allowed in the neighborhood.
Okay. Thank you. Lori?
See, that guy. You were talking about suggestions as to how we might be able to make it clearer what some of these changes are.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was thinking about was, for example, last night, the discussion about the 2,700 and the 3,000 square feet. If we had a floor plan, not a floor plan, a site plan of what it is now with the 3,500 square feet on a lot. This is what it looks like. This is what it would allow. And it might be 2, because it allows now 2 units on that 3,500 square foot area. So this is what it looks like in a site plan now. And then this is what it looks like if it's 1 dwelling unit, 3,000 square feet. If it's 2 dwelling units, what that looks like. And maybe just having that. You've done that in other places in the document, and I think that's a really good way to illustrate it. People might be able to visualize what that looks like. And it would be clear that a single dwelling unit needs 3,000 square feet, and if you want to put 2 on that lot, then this is what the site plan would have to look like.
Okay, yeah, good idea.
And I agree with Lee that we want a document that we can use for a long time. This needs to be suitable for, looking 10, 20 years, 30 years maybe down the road as to what Missoula might look like. I think we have a little different vision of what that might be, because I see that growth is coming. We're not going to be able to stop that, and in fact, I don't think we want to stop it. A healthy economy, by its very definition, is one that has some growth. And that also, by definition, means that we are going to be looking at some denser housing, more multifamily and denser. That doesn't mean it has to be in existing neighborhoods, but I think we do need to have zoning provisions that allow that option as we move forward into new areas, or as we look at large areas in the city that are not yet developed. What I would hate to see happen here is that we don't have tools that we need in the future, and we need to be planning for that. We can protect our neighborhoods. Surely we can write standards that have those kinds of protections in them. There are very real concerns with traffic, with renters. Those are very real concerns. I think we can have ways that we can address those that without requiring that we take all those options out of the zoning code. Because I really think we have a duty to the generations that come after us to have a document that they can use to accommodate the population that we'll have as we go forward. Because who knows what's going to, who knows, 10 years from now you might need that accessory dwelling unit for your mom to live in. So I'd just like to, I want to be able to build into the document the tools that I think will be needed in the future to accommodate growth in appropriate places, with some tools like the neighborhood character overlay, which I think is a great way to approach things, that protect neighborhoods in where they don't want those things. Because, as I said, I think those are very real problems. So I think we're making some real progress. I'm actually quite hopeful that we're going to come out with a document here that that will be really useful for many years. And perhaps we need to look at, as Brian was saying, at ways that build in some more protections and just ensure that we respect the neighbor's rights.
Good. Great. Thank you.
Based on some of the discussions last night, and I don't know if it's coming, but in the current code there is something for when 2 homes are on a single parcel, and I don't think that's in this code, or at least we haven't got it yet. But when those things happen, there was a really well thought out development in our neighborhood, and it's won some awards by the neighborhoods for best design. And it's actually a boundary line relocation. But the way that it was done, I think would be a good example of ways to try to encourage if 2 homes or 2 dwelling units were going to go onto a single lot. Some of the things that they did, they protected the adjacent property owners by basically facing the buildings towards the development and away from the neighbors. To protect their backyards. They shared driveways, they shared walkways, they shared parking areas, which was great because you didn't end up with a ton of driveway. Then they also, the buildings themselves seemed to be closer together because garages are allowed to be closer in rear yard setbacks. So it basically made the development seem like it was closer to the street, all the houses. Instead of a house close to the street and then a house way back in the alley staring into everyone's backyard. So the houses in the front had more of a courtyard between them, and then the houses in the back also looked into the courtyards and had a little more backyard. But it looks good from the street. It's nice to walk in there. But it would be nice to have something in the new code to help address that, because the current definition is really terrible. It actually forces that backyard house, when they go in, to basically crowd all the neighbors' backyards. Be nice to get rid of that. Neighborhood character overlays, I guess it'd be nice to see something in there to say that the approval of those, it should be done by the majority or supermajority of the neighborhoods, to get it started. I assume they're going to pay for it. It's got to be expensive to do. And considering it could affect everything, you want to make sure as many of the property owners are actually involved and know what's going on in it. I think they're a really good idea, but you got to make sure you get everyone involved. Some comments I got at our table last night that I just wanted to pass on, just in case my scribbling wasn't really good. I was writing very fast. But one gentleman, he said he thought the PUDs, they should stay open-ended, and there should not be a density limit. One person actually said she did not care at all about building heights. It could be 35 or 40 feet. She says you can't tell the difference anyway. There was another person that counteracted that argument with it's important to try to keep some light and ventilation to the buildings, but that was a new one, so I thought I'd bring that one up. For the majority, the table wanted ADUs. A really good one that also came up, that the public needs a lot more education on what their current zoning is and then how the revised zoning affects them. A lot of people had just barely had a grasp even what their own zoning was that their houses were on. So it's really hard to fathom all the changes when you don't understand what's there in the first place. And then another strong one that came through was commercial really should be allowed in all zoning districts to some extent, whatever those districts feel are appropriate. Because the underlying grudge, I guess, is why should all the suburbs basically drive through our neighborhood to get their services? So their neighborhood was basically being impacted by traffic and whatever because the outlying neighborhoods didn't have any services and didn't allow or didn't want them. And basically they felt it was being forced down on them. And that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jan.
Okay. First of all, a question on group living, which is 20-40-4. And that allows up to 8 people living on a piece of property. And I'm sure I don't understand this, so I'm asking the question, what is the purpose of this? It looks to me like you can have a lot of people living in a single home. They could all be students, and in a university town, I see that as a risk. And nobody's discussed this, so I'd like just some clarification for what that's about. Kirk, I don't know how much of what we said yesterday at the noon meeting that you weren't able to attend you've heard, or if I should repeat some of those things.
I had a pretty long briefing today on the discussion regarding Chapter 85,
Right.
With the procedures. A lot of input on the administrative adjustment concept and the notion of maybe some more specificity about the number of neighbors that could oppose something and then kick it up. So I got a lot of detailed comments about it.
Okay.
I feel, yeah.
Okay. I won't go over all of that. I do want to say something about the PUDs and the review criteria. The review criteria for the preliminary, which is what is used before the one and only public hearing, is different from the review criteria that's used later on to see if there is consistency with the preliminary criteria. And if that's confusing to people, I can understand why. What I'm concerned about is that in the preliminary review criteria, there needs to be some mention of it being suitable for the neighborhood. And you do find a statement in that when you're looking later on at the consistency with the preliminary criteria. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it does.
All right. Under definitions, I asked before about gross and net density, and I'd also like to see a definition of parcel and lot. With ADUs and any of these major variances, a couple of things, just observations. The adjacent properties, which would be the most heavily affected, if there could be some extra consideration given to those people. And another thing that's really important when you're looking at something fitting into a neighborhood is the front yard setback. If you move something really close to the sidewalk and the others are back, then the line of sight and a lot of other things are just disturbed. It doesn't feel right. Another comment on ADUs, enforcement, being sure that the larger home is owner occupied. As at the present time, there's no way of enforcing that. And it looks to me like both of those would end up being rentals. And I could tell by the discussion in the group last night that many people thought that those two properties could be sold off separately. And I suppose that could happen if the property was subdivided. I've asked about this before, and I still need to be shown. My dad was from Missouri. How, with conservation, with R10, if you take out 60% for open space and add 20% more houses as a density bonus for doing the conservation, and then you put in driveways, alleys, and easements, how do you have enough space for the homes that need to be placed on that property? I'd like to see some arrangements. So down the line, if you could come up with some illustrations so I can see how that would work. I can see how it works with larger sizes, and I really don't see how it would work with properties below the 10,000 square foot size. I echo Lee's statement about the lot line side space not being used as a driveway, and I just don't want to see more concrete than necessary.
Yeah, that's good.
Under BOA, I would like to see or practical difficulties removed from the appeal basis. And I know that that's under discussion. I think there needs to be 30 days for all appeals, just because people can't get it put together in 15. That's a real crunch. And where posting, mailing, and newspaper are mentioned, I think all of those should come out 15 days early, and that's just a matter of consistency. It's there in some places and not in others. Okay.
Right. Laval briefed me on those issues, and I appreciate you sharing it with folks who didn't come. It's a good summary of what I heard,
Right.
and
Okay.
we will
Thank
be
you.
addressing that. Lori, question? Sure.
Just something I forgot to mention was I still have some concerns about requiring commercial in a mixed-use building, simply because I know how extremely difficult it might be to get financing to do that, and I know how difficult it is to get somebody to come into that commercial space. So I still have some reservations about that. I love mixed use. I'm all in favor of it. I just think there's some real obstacles to being able to do it on a mandatory basis.
Okay. Gary?
Well, I appreciate all the comments on the design and regulations within the residential construction in the neighborhoods. I'd like to take my time to talk a little bit about a commercial issue and the change in the sign ordinance. This one hits me dear to heart, and I know we've spent a lot of time in years past looking at this particular issue, and it can be highly contested within the community. If it's okay, I'd like to go through a couple of questions and a couple of suggestions within the sign ordinance itself. First, the purpose. The way it's drafted, it appears, and I understand this is probably past language, but it appears that it is a save-all for all of Missoula. It says the sign regulations of this chapter are intended to protect the health, safety, and general welfare by establishing standards for design, construction, location, illumination, and maintenance of all signs and sign structures. Possibly a rewording on that would be better. I'm not sure that signs are going to save everybody or hurt everybody, and a softening or a change in that, saying this is more of a guide to the placement, the display, the use of signs, rather than stating that it's all on public safety and health and welfare. That's just a first comment. Under C, right under purpose, the last sentence of C, and to promote an attractive visual environment, is redundant. It's stated in the next one, D, so I think that could be eliminated. Just a minor thing there. When we move on and we get into maintenance required, which is the next page, C, maintenance required, number 4. When I read that, I kind of worry about the maintenance on historic signs. We have several buildings in the downtown area that have old signs, such as on the side of historic buildings that were hotels or whatever. And if you look on the side of the building, yes, the signs are weathered. They have not been maintained, but they are of historic value. The way this is stated, they will have to be removed. And I'm a little concerned about that. It could be overlooked. We could just say, well, those signs have been there forever, but under the way that it's drafted, it would appear that we'd have to get rid of all those old historic signs on the side of some of the downtown buildings. That could be reworded or else dropped from that. Then I move over to prohibited signs and sign characters, which is 20.75.040 B, and it says string lines or streamers of exposed light bulbs except traditional holiday decorations. This is already addressed in the outdoor lighting ordinance, and it really does not have anything to do with signage. So that whole line could be struck from there because it is addressed elsewhere. And I would like to talk a little bit about, under the same prohibited signs and sign characteristics, D, things that are allowed, these are prohibited, you cannot have these, and it says D, flashing, blinking, or scintillating signs. An awful lot of the new signs that we see around town that have recent permits and recent construction do have some of these characteristics. They are electronic, and I understand that they are relatively new, and we have a new section in here with regard to electronics, but that could be addressed or stricken because it is also in the electronic section of this. Then down below at G it says electronic graphic displays, billboards. That's a new one that you have brought in. I'm not sure where that came from other than to address some of the new signs that we are seeing in town. I'm not sure we want to totally eliminate the new possibilities in signs. And the graphic displays that we do see on these new signs would now become prohibited, so we couldn't use them. Personally, I think some of them are very tasteful. We've got newer signs that have different designs, different graphics that are on them. So I would like that line stricken if possible. Under I, just under that, we talk about temporary and mobile signs. Then I think about a fleet of buses that run around town that have signs on them. Are we talking about the fact that we'll have to eliminate the use of signs on the buses? appears that would be the case. So a rewriting of that might be necessary. If we go a little farther and we get into, and I won't hit all of them that I have questions on, we don't have time, but under electronic graphic design signs, which is changeable copy, and this is on page 20.75-9, under spacing, electronic graphic signs, G, spacing. You're asking for a 250-foot distance from residential zoning. Now, as I look around town, we find several arterial streets that on the back side of the block is residential. The front side definitely is commercial and it abuts the arterial. And it's definitely closer than 250 foot to the arterial to the back side of their lot. So we could be in a situation of eliminating signs on several arterial streets. That needs to be reduced, in my opinion, to 100 feet. Might be able to live with 150 feet, but that's cutting it really close considering the depth of a lot. So 100 foot would make more sense than 250. Under message duration, which is just below, it does say that you can only have, or you have to have the message there for 8 seconds. And if you think about signs that change, electronic signs change their copy regularly, 8 seconds is quite a long time. I don't know where that came from. I do know that the intent is not to have blinking signs that flash different messages or logos on and off, on and off. But 8 seconds is a long time to hold something. Maybe reduce that down to 2 seconds. 2 seconds is a fair amount of time. 8, I'm not sure that's possible or even what is necessary. Under brightness, just below that, we talk about a maximum illumination of 5,000 nits, and that's during the daytime, and it has to be reduced to 500 nits during the evening or the night. From what I understand after talking to people in the sign business and the manufacturing part of the sign business with the new LEDs, it is kind of a controversial issue of how to measure the intensity of LED lights. There is some equipment you can buy. At what distance from the sign do you measure? The standards vary from one manufacturer to another. And my point in saying this is that 5,000 is below what some of the manufacturers in the U.S. even manufacture. You could not buy it. They're at 7,500 or 10,000. But there are some offshore manufacturers that say they have a 5,000 nit light. Well, then the question comes in, how do you measure it and all this other? I'm questioning whether we need to have that low of a nit measurement in there. Maybe it should be increased to satisfy the U.S. manufacturers. It could be 10,000. And then rather than having it down to 5,000 at night, say it will be reduced to 1/10 of daytime, which would be 1,000 or something of that nature. But I would like to see us have the ability to purchase onshore lighting, LED lighting in our signs. And I believe that Linda would like to probably talk about a few of these as well. But My next one, and I think I'll just stop at that, I do have plenty more, would be under changeable copy signs and page 20.75-11. Electronic, and it's under service stations, E, electronic reader boards. It states in here we can only have a single color of light in an electronic sign. Now the intent, when you drive around town and you look at the new electronic signs for most of the service stations, what they are doing is trying to match color to fuel type. In other words, they're using red for standard fuels and a green for diesel. And if you go to the pump, you'll find that all the diesel handles are green. So that is the intent. We have two colors that are being displayed, and according to this, it should be reduced down to a single color. So I'm not sure that's productive. It could be counterproductive. But I'll stop there and say that we do have some other concerns with regard to signage. I'm not sure where this new language came from, if it came from Chicago or if it came from Missoula OPG or just where it came from, but we need to look a little closer at this and maybe negotiate through it and work through some changes and make some reasonable possibilities for business.
Okay, great.
Thank
thanks.
you.
Thanks. We heard a lot from Linda last time. She regaled us with many thoughts about the sign chapter, and we're certainly thankful for getting her detailed list and would welcome your additional detailed comments about things that you think need to be addressed.
There's several things I'd like to hit on, I guess, after last night's meeting. I'd probably start by saying that contrary to what I think was a fairly negative tone to a lot of the comments last night, I think that what we have in front of us thus far is a very professional, well-done product. There are some rough edges that need to be worked out, but I do not think that that the end of the world is at hand because of this, and I don't think that this is a conspiracy for special interest groups. I believe that this advisory group that was assembled was purposely assembled to be a very diverse group of people. And while we may all have special interests in our daily jobs, I would hope, or at least I maybe somewhat conceitedly believe that we're all professionals that are capable of listening and going further than just our own special interests with this process. If we have special interests in our group or in the public comments that we've received, I think one of the special interests that isn't recognized is the no change group. There seems to be, a lot of comment that good, bad, or indifferent, we like it the way it is. And that's understandable. Nobody likes change. I think a lot of the public comments, a lot of it is just the fact that the public is never going to fully understand this, or not the majority of the public. If this process that we're in has to depend upon full understanding by the entire public and a buy-in by the entire public to what we have in front of us, it's never going to get done. The public, I was pleased that Laval cleared the record last night as to public notification. I don't know what else can be done to notify the public about this process and how to participate in this process. Every line of media that there is was used. And so the public, just generally speaking, doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to these things. And then when you show up in the middle of it, it doesn't make sense. We've spent so much time talking about the height of houses and lot line houses. Well, the truth of the matter is that the height thing works fine. And in fact, probably restricts heights from the ordinance as it now reads. Because it eliminates the modified height measurement. Lot line houses, you could build an entire block of houses with our current setbacks, and every one of those would have a 5-yard setback. You could leave the houses right where they are and move all of the lot lines over after the houses are built, and everybody would have a side yard. It's that simple. It doesn't increase density, it doesn't do anything. It just makes the yard more usable. And I think that's a good thing. One of the comments that really struck home with me last night was the need for more commercial development in all residential neighborhoods. Missoula is spending a lot of time, money, and energy trying to make this a non-motorized city. A lot of money is spent on buses, bike and ped facilities. In my personal opinion, I think there's a very vocal minority of folks that may be moving things in that direction. Whether or not it will ever work remains to be seen. I don't think it has worked well thus far, and we've been at it for at least 10 years. And yet our congestion continues to get worse. If my opinion is wrong, though, and we are going to become a non-motorized city, part of the problem is, and somebody made this comment last night, if you want to buy a loaf of bread, you have to get in your car if you're 90% of Missoula. And the only way that's going to change, if this growth being pushed inward is going to work, if we are going to take people out of their cars, we're going to need more neighborhood commercial facilities. I just had a couple questions about the conservation development and the neighborhood preservation overlay. I think it needs to be very clear who initiates those actions, and to reiterate a comment that was made earlier tonight, in addition to protecting neighborhoods, I think there also needs to be some protection of minorities. These things or minority as in not the majority of the neighborhood. These things can work both ways. There may well be 3 or 4 people within the block that have some plan, maybe purchase their property with some plans in mind, and would see their plans nixed by a conservation development overlay or a preservation overlay. So I think the protection part needs to work both ways. And I don't know how best to go about doing that. If there can be provisions for an opt-out for those that don't want to, even within a block, it's something that needs to be thought about. And then I guess a couple other things. There seems to be a perception that all of Missoula hates PNCs, and I don't think that's the case. There are a handful of poster childs for why we all shouldn't like PNCs. But there are a lot of very well done PNCs that already exist in this town and have created affordable housing. There's families living in them. They're owner occupied. There's room for their kids to play in the backyard. There are a lot of well-designed PNCs. And if ADUs are another way to provide that type of housing, certainly I think it was the right move to take the initial ADU proposal off the table. I would like to see it come back, and I was pleased to hear the support for that last night, with some design standards. And I think if it were proposed as an overlay with protest provisions, that's a fair way to do those. And if there were design standards, so that if they're done, that they're done right, I think it is something that could work in some, if not the majority of neighborhoods. We'd want to be careful not to get too carried away with design standards, or we would defeat the purpose of your typical ADU. And one other thing, I know you were, or at least I believe you were given a letter from the Missoula Organization of Realtors last night. Just wanted to reiterate that. That's something that has been discussed at length, is a fairly subtle change in the townhouse regulations, but the impact would be fairly significant in that where the current townhouse regulations are designed where there would be exceptions to the zoning as now changed, those regulations would apply to all townhouses wherever they are, and that's probably not a good thing. It creates a disincentive for a affordable housing tool. That, I believe, is about all I had. Once again, appreciate the efforts, and I think, proof is in the details, but we're getting there.
Thank you. You guys too. Okay, a couple more, and then we'll take a few minutes for public comment.
I'll be pretty brief. I wasn't at last night's meeting. I apologize for that. I had a conflict. Too many meetings. Just a general observation. There's been a lot of processes going on in Missoula recently, or over the last year. The Envision Missoula process that was primarily a transportation-oriented process, but spent a lot of time talking about what people envisioned Missoula would look like, as the name would imply. The UFDA process that we've been going through. Both of those processes reached the conclusion, although I don't necessarily agree with that Missoula's growth ought to be right here in the urban. Oh, it was lit up when I started, I thought.
I'll vouch for it. It was lit up.
There, it's on now, I guess. I'll talk, you watch the light. But the growth of Missoula in over the next 20 or 25 or 50 years should be in the urban area for the most part. And as Ken indicated, we should be becoming less dependent on the automobile and more dependent on light rail and urban transportation and bicycles and foot and all of those things. If in fact that's going to happen, a lot of what I've heard tonight and have heard at previous meetings, particularly by folks from neighborhood groups, and I understand their position, is in direct conflict with that. And I sat at some of those Envision Missoula meetings where we sat with a big map and we all had little stickers that we stuck on the maps with 4,000 people here and 2,000 people here, and people are sticking them in the university area and they're sticking them in the slant street neighborhoods, and I'm saying, that looks great on a map. All you got to do is try to do it. You know, that never going to happen in Missoula, and it isn't. But we, if in fact we're going to try to do less sprawl, we need to and do more infill, if you will, or more density within the urbanized area. We need to have a lot of the flexibility and the tools available that you're proposing here, and I think those are good. You know, some of them probably need a little tweaking, but you know, the ADUs are one of them. The lot line houses are another one. The higher density and PUDs and some of those things are all good. But if we're poo-pooing all of those sorts of things in this process, But the Envision, Missoula, and UFTA, and all those people are saying, yeah, but boy, we got to put everybody in the urban area and in town here. We're headed for a collision, and we don't need to be doing that. I think we all need to be on the same track to some degree, and I don't. I'm not sure we are, and like I say, I don't disagree that we should be trying to build more in the urbanized area. I don't think we ought to be doing that quite to the degree that I heard a lot of people say at the Envision Missoula process and the UFTA. But I'm just concerned that we're headed on a collision course if we don't allow some of the flexibility and some of the creativity in developing in the urban area. And we have to change. Ken commented about the no change feeling, and certainly people that live in neighborhoods that they're comfortable in think that's good, but some change is necessary as we move forward, particularly if we're going to grow, and particularly if we're going to grow within. I think we need to allow some of that stuff, and I also applaud your effort here. I think you're doing a great job, and it needs some work, but we're getting there.
Thank you. Linda.
It's on, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to be brief too. I want to thank Gary for your comments. I know you weren't here at our last meeting and did hear my rambling on, but you and I haven't had a chance to talk about it, so you touched on a few things, and there are a lot more that I touched on. But Kirk, I did miss, and Tom, I did miss the fact that while I applauded that you're willing to go for the digital fuel price signs, it is, I believe, it's a federal regulation that diesel has to be displayed in green, and it has to the public has to be able to identify diesel from regular fuel. And so I think that's a minor change because they're steady burning. They're not changing. So that, I think, is a very good point that needs to be addressed, that comes under a federal safety regulation to the public. And I really don't have anything else to say about the signs tonight, given with what's happening through the Urban Initiative Group down at the city. And I'll be glad to share with you what I shared with Kirk and the group at the last meeting. What I would like to do now is jump over to what everybody says they're not going to talk about, is the ADU. I do live in an R2 zoning, and I've always considered, I have my house is 107 years old under the many changes my dad did through the years. But anyway, I know from what I'm seeing in this change that for this, if this ADU were to happen, since I'm zoned for duplex, and if we're allowed to put two houses on instead of one duplex, put two houses on, is that correct? One thing I haven't found that has been addressed that could be in there is that with duplex, the off-street parking requirement for duplexes, I believe, is 4 off-street parking areas. Well, if you put 2 single houses on a split lot, what parking rule applies to that? And if the houses were set front and back, which probably in most instances they would be, not side by side on the property, but front and back, how would the people that are in the ADU dwelling, or the second dwelling, they would have to walk from the front to the back, or would they be allowed alley access to parking? So there was no parking rule that I could see addressed to that splitting. And what it does for me is I'm in a situation now where immediately to the left on my property, I have a split property next to me, a 2-lot that was split in half a gazillion years ago, granted. And there are 2 houses there that border my left-hand property line with garages, with auxiliary dwellings. And And so I'm really boxed in along on my left-hand side. So now on the right-hand side for my backyard, if those people were to go ahead and build a second house back on their property, I would be boxed in there. So I would form a really nice, if I kept up my yard, a really nice back courtyard for these people. And they would be boxing me in from my view and from sharing hot dog recipes with my neighbor as he barbecued. And I'm just a little nervous about the splitting two houses instead, or putting two houses on the same property. I also figured it out, if I was right on the size, that if I was inclined to, I could lift up my 107-year-old house, find a neighborhood that accepts a duplex house, plant it there, and then build 4 houses on my property. And maybe 3, maybe 3.5, but I believe I have enough to do 4. So what happens to the parking in that instance then? Where does everybody park? So that would be, to me, really a bad thing to happen in an old established neighborhood like mine. And that's why I think it's got to really have a good formula for parking and the fact that I've lived there all my life, and this is a story everybody says that's concerned about this, but my mom and dad worked hard for that house, and I've kept the upkeep in the neighborhood. I enjoyed the neighborhood. Why should I have to think about maybe there will be something that will lessen my enjoyment of my property? So that is basically all I have to say. I just am done.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Okay, let's take 10 minutes. I ask that people be respectful of. How many folks want to talk? Harold, 2. We got 2. Okay, great. If, like I say, if we could limit it to no more than 3 or 4 minutes apiece, that'd be great, and we'll get everybody out on time. Thank you, Harold. Here, why don't you take mine?
Borrow your chair there.
Sure.
Name's Harold Holm. I live up in the Rattlesnake, and I will try to be brief, and hopefully I can follow this up in writing so I don't have to take up a whole bunch of time on a little bunch of details. When it comes to doing conservation development, we just haven't done a good job of that. It just hasn't been done. And yet many of our plans and many of our in our comprehensive plan say we encourage cluster development. Well, it wasn't enough encouragement because it hasn't happened. And I want to see this happen or something like it. And I don't know quite how when you get into density bonuses, Missoula's had a bad experience with density bonuses, and that's why they got rid of them. But people really didn't get much for them. In this case, you'd be getting something for your bonus. The only thing I'm a little concerned about is, on the one hand, you have a PUD. On the other hand, which is also a state tool, and I haven't researched the state law on this, but plan to see if if we're in conformity with that. But if you're going to allow a 20% density bonus on the conservation side and a 50% on the PUD side, are you really creating a situation where you have competing ordinances? And Lee mentioned perhaps you could make them both 20%. I did quite a bit of research on basically flexible zoning a couple of years ago as part of the zoning issues subcommittee that Dick was on. And the density bonuses at that time were very minimal, and yet they seemed to get done. In some cases 10, 15%. But what really is important is what's the developer going to go for so that you actually get this done? Is he going to be satisfied with 20% for a conservation type thing when you can get 50% with a PUD? And this has to somehow be resolved, I think. And I don't know if there's any such thing as requiring a PUD or requiring cluster development, conservation type development on a piece of property. That would ensure that you got it done. But I think you'd have to reach out to the special interest, the developer side, and ask them, what are you going to do? Because if you still got the option of just, leaving this, and I'm talking about bigger areas here now, just selling off bigger acreages where they can get maybe more money for those, then, what are you doing? Having an ordinance that's sitting on the book gathering dust. So I really hope that somebody will come up to the plate here, because there's a whole lot of good reasons for setting aside open space, a whole lot of good reasons for the developer for reducing his infrastructure costs. And somehow I hope we can bring these two things together. One other major thing here is we talked about preserving farmland last night, but I didn't see it showing up here anyway. One of the interesting things is Andres Dewani, who's the new urbanist guru, saw an article the other day where he's saying farmland should be the new golf course. People like looking at farmland. And I thought, wow, what an interesting thing for Missoula. Perhaps you could have a new urbanist development that's got commercial, and such as Mackenzie Town, which I visited up in Calgary. Instead of having a golf course down there, wow, you've got cabbages and carrots and pumpkins. At any rate, that needs exploring. One other major thing, this is going to be a modernizing process, hopefully we're doing. One of the problems going on here as we try to modernize is the climate's changing pretty darn fast. We're getting more fires, more intense fires. Just ask California. I was just down in California where those fires were going. And fire-wise, as a concept, we've done meetings up in the Rattlesnake with all of the agencies involved in fire. It was a really good meeting. We have the disc for that if anyone would like to see it. I'd like to see that worked into our zoning law somehow, because you have areas that are fire-prone. Grassland, you're building houses out in the grassland areas. Some of your design standards in your hillside design actually show you having a deck sitting out there, a slope down below you, and requiring that you have landscaping underneath that house. And that's totally contrary to Firewise. And so we should look for consistencies that way. And I hope we can incorporate Firewise into a lot of our stuff we're doing in Missoula. This is, a really good place to maybe be innovative and creative in doing that. Thanks very much. I won't keep you anymore. I am going to send off a few other things based on what I've heard tonight, if I can.
Thank you, Dan. Take your list with me.
Hi, I'm Darrell McNinney, and I live out in the south side. First of all, I'd like to kind of pick up on some of the things that some of you first folks talked about, getting the public involved in this. And, I'm hearing what you're saying over here, that the public, 50,000 of us or whatever it is now, we're not all going to agree. So somehow you've got to reach a balance here. But I guess kind of speaking for myself and what I would think would be a lot of folks that are residents of this community, somebody over here said, most of us don't even know what our zoning is. I think that was you. And I think you're right. A lot of us don't. And if we do, we really don't know what that entails. And now, I think we're going to change a bunch of that to some extent. And I have no idea what that all means, because I haven't previously been to a meeting, because I didn't know about them and didn't, I knew there was some zoning going on, but I've never really realized or figured out how the public got involved in that. So maybe there needs to be a little more advance warning to us. Well, to sum up where I'm at, and I think probably even a lot of us in this room, we live in a house someplace in a residential neighborhood. Now, why did we buy into that neighborhood? One, because of the zoning and because we liked that neighborhood. So probably the integrity of what's there is something that we desire. We don't want too much additional change. And that's kind of the way I feel about it. You know, I'm looking at things like home occupations, and I'm saying, well, you know, I don't really want the guy next door to come in and you know, build a whatever. I don't want that commercial development there. I don't even know if I want what apparently the contradiction is here of some additional people and some additional customers and additional traffic and you know, now more worry about the kids in the neighborhood, whether they're going to get run over and all this kind of stuff. You know, is this truck traffic? Those kinds of things that probably don't fit in our residential neighborhoods. So we're all kind of NIMBYs, aren't we? Well, we'd like to have all this stuff, but don't put it in my damn backyard, folks. And that's kind of where probably almost all of us are as far as our own house, our own residence, our own neighborhood goes. So I guess let's just be careful about how far we go in that, you know, in all those other directions. Let's try to preserve these neighborhoods as best we can, and you know, the new neighborhoods, people know what they're buying into, but the old neighborhoods, let's be careful what we do. And I guess that'd just kind of be my caution, and hopefully we'll think about, what do I want to happen in my neighborhood? All of you are working on this. Think about that, and we probably won't have a problem here. Thank you.
Thank you. An apt conclusion to our evening, I think, and I'm really heed that advice. I'm trying to accommodate the type of change that is in our future, and yet do so with a light touch and do so with the utmost attention to the protection of established neighborhoods. I truly share that goal with you all, and I appreciate your help in making sure that we get there, or get as close as we can to that right balance. So I'd like you to take the rest of the year off as advisory group members. I'm sure you have other things you can do. We don't have at this moment, I don't have an exact date for when our next meeting will be. We'll give you ample notice. Laval will see to it that we give you ample notice. As I mentioned earlier, I think the next thing you're going to get via email or hard copy or both is a consolidated revised draft of the zoning provisions. So look forward to getting that. Shortly on the heels of that, we'll start work on the subdivision regulations. You all know about the website and how to get a hold of Val and me. So, Brian.
I have this sort of pot-shot question, which I maybe not get a chance to ask you. Pot-shot question. You know, frankly, I didn't get time to digest that process part very. But just in a broad perspective, we would hope that something has been done to reduce the time frames to implement the process, and maybe we've made a significant dent in the staff requirements to handle this process. What's your thinking on that? Have we made any substantive improvements here, or have we just got the same process that we had before?
You're talking about the procedures for review of development applications, zoning changes.
As everybody around here knows who've been involved, it's a very awkward, long process to get through this maze. Dick Ainsworth knows that when you got appearing to the planning board at least twice, maybe twice, and then you got to you got to appear before one or two or three sessions of the city council committees, and then you got to finally go to the final public hearing, which may be one time, but maybe two. So it involves a tremendous amount of man-hours from the staff viewpoint, and also a really demanding thing on the citizens if they hope to keep up with professionals who are following this and pushing these things through.
Yeah, my honest appraisal is we're nibbling around the edges with the procedures article in its present form does not represent a sea change in terms of streamlining the development review process. And the honest reason for that is that so many of those procedures are, one, dictated by the state law in terms of how the process needs to work, and two, that control of how the process actually works is well beyond words in a book. We can write out the procedure, and it's a three-step process, but if multiple hearings are required because you get bumped from an agenda or you have incomplete information or the fact that a continuance is requested, those are things that the ordinance simply can't control. I think we can and are doing things like ensuring that you don't have to go to the PAZ to request to be on an agenda at the council and then come back the following week. We are kind of trying to clean up some of that business, but beyond that, I can't point to significant changes in the procedures for the reasons I've outlined.
Yeah, that's what I expected. I think we tried, it really is a manpower eater and a time eater for everybody involved.
And frankly, the other reason, Brian, is that for many people, the ability to show up at a hearing and participate in the process is important. And our efforts to so-called streamline the process could be perceived as thwarting the ability of folks to participate in the process. So we're needing to always be mindful of that sort of balance as well.
And obviously, there's a reluctance to delegate decision-making.
I've sensed that among some. Others have. There was one comment last night that said we need more delegation of bounded
most
delegation
corporations
of
would fail
authority.
if they didn't delegate more authority in the city government.
And the administrative adjustment was obviously our effort to stick a toe in the water in that regard. We have used that successfully in a variety of jurisdictions, big, small, and in between, and hope that we can keep that alive and that you can test that over time and you'll see, it does work, and that we could maybe add a few more things to the bucket of things that could be approved administratively. But we'll see how that plays out. Lee, one more comment and we're going to close it
Very
up.
quick. When you make this review, will you have it highlighted showing all of the changes that you're making so that we know what are
Dennis,
new items?
Do you want to answer that for us?
Yes, Lee, after I give Kirk an example. And he chooses to follow it.
Yes, absolutely. I have committed on a number of occasions to do a red line and strikeout version that will allow you to quickly identify what's been changed. Thank you all so much. Another great year. Look forward to continuing the journey next year.